Memphis is known worldwide for its music, from W.C. Handy's blues to the birth of rock and roll. Tonight on The Best Times, we talk with the author of a new book about the racial mix that created the Memphis sound. And we'll leave you with some Memphis-inspired blues from Butch Mudbone. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you. Hello, I'm Chris Hardaway. Welcome to this edition of The Best Times, a series that looks at life after 50. In 1954, Sam Phillips and Elvis Presley rocked the music world with a sound that became associated with the place where it was recorded. Today, Memphis is recognized worldwide as the home of the blues and the cradle of American music. The blues, gospel, the jazz, and rock and roll that came from here has influenced multiple generations of musicians. But what made Memphis so special? Was there something unique about the city that gave birth to the blues of W.C. Handy and the rock and roll of Elvis Presley? And how did black and white musicians come together in a city with a deep-seated history of racial division? These are the themes of a new book by music historian David Less called Memphis Mayhem. David, thank you very much for being on The Best Time to talk about your book, Memphis Mayhem. In the opening of the book, there was one sentence that struck me. You wrote, "The great paradox of Memphis music is that it transcends race and genre while simultaneously being defined by both." What do you mean by that?
Well, I just thought it was a cool sentence, to be honest with you. It does make sense. What I mean is I don't think that music genres make sense. I think genres are a marketing tool, either by retail or radio. All of the music is basically the same. When you listen to Memphis music, you're hearing Memphis music, whether it's rockabilly, rock and roll, soul music, gospel, whatever, rap, whatever you're hearing, you're basically hearing music from Memphis. It's all basically meat from the same bone to me. And in terms of race, the racial aspects of it is basically, to me, the collision of blacks and whites, which is what the book is basically about. So Memphis music is true African-American and European music together. African-American doesn't mean African music, it means African music and American music.
What made Memphis the melting pot for this music?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that really happened. It's really cultural. It's ingrained here. A lot of people in Memphis in the South, and it's not totally unique to Memphis, but it coalesced here probably best. You have African Americans post-slavery that basically had nothing. You had poor whites who really had nothing. But the difference in Memphis versus all of these other places where it came from is that Memphis had the yellow fever epidemics. And the story really starts there, because what happened in the yellow fever was Memphis was sort of a metropolis. It was a growing American city. And all of a sudden it was devastated with these 3 yellow fever epidemics. And everybody who could afford to leave would leave, which basically were white people, and leaving a large African-American population with a city that had a huge infrastructure that was basically a metropolis. And so the racial imbalance that created, it took the yellow fever epidemics to be over. White people began to come back and began to reclaim, but it took decades. And that period of time changed the racial imbalance, and it changed it forever. And I think that the music really came from that.
Let's jump ahead a few years past the yellow fever, and let's talk about Beale Street. You say that Beale Street, you call it the intersection of the Delta's rural music and Memphis's urban music. So what does Beale Street mean to the history of Memphis music?
Well, it means quite a lot. I mean, it was Black Main Street USA is what they called it. And Memphis, as you know, they call it the capital of Mississippi, but it is and has been the hub for commerce, trade, for 100-mile radius or more. So people from Arkansas, from, as far as Missouri, certainly Mississippi, even Alabama, came to Memphis to sell their wares, farmers, cotton, of course, all of that agricultural was here, and it left people with money in their pockets. And Beale Street was the entertainment nexus for primarily African Americans, but also white people went there during the day and shopped. And as a result, it became, like I said, Black Main Street. So you had a lot of people in from out of town who would come to Beale Street and look for entertainment. And when that happens, that's where the entertainers go. And so there were saloons and street corner, the rural people played on the street corners, more sophisticated people inside, piano players inside the saloons, lots of gambling. And it was it was a center of entertainment and activity.
One thing that surprised me in reading the book that I did not realize was the fact that on Beale Street, I presume this is perhaps during some of the later years, there was actually integration among some of the musicians that performed there.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Memphis musicians really began performing together very early on, blacks and whites. It didn't happen really on stage formally until the 30s with Teddy Wilson and the Benny Goodman Trio. Here, blacks and whites were performing together as early as probably the 1940s on stage and in the clubs. And even recording as early in the 1950s. Sam Phillips recorded black and white musicians.
Well, now that you mentioned Sam Phillips, I guess we got to bring Elvis into this conversation. You can't have a conversation about Memphis music without talking about Elvis. You said in the book, you wrote that specific circumstances which could only have transpired in Memphis allowed Elvis to become a big rock and roll star. What was the magic in Memphis? How did that work?
Well, what happened was, like anything else, you have to have, first off, sympathetic ears, but an infrastructure of a music business. Sam Phillips was in the music business. He had recorded blues, hit blues. If Sam never recorded Elvis, he would be a legendary producer for all the blues acts that he had discovered and recorded. And so he had an ear for it. He was sympathetic to it. He knew how to record from the days of the Skyway recording the big bands. So he understood the recording process. And because of where he mic'd things, he heard drums. He was a drummer. And he just had that feel for it. So he had a feel for the music. When Elvis came in, he was not looking to play black music. He was just, that happened. The famous story of Elvis goofing around during a break and inventing rock and roll that everybody knows is probably true. But in fact, in Nashville, they'd say, shut up and let's get back to something else. Or virtually anywhere else, and any other producer would have said that. But Sam had an affinity for the music. And he not only had an affinity for it, he recognized the financial possibilities because he had made money at it. And he was a businessman. So, where another producer maybe said, okay, that's kind of cool. He understood it could make money. And Memphis had the infrastructure. We had a pressing plant, plastic products where he could take it and get it pressed. We had a disc jockey, Dewey Phillips, who was, sympathetic and played black music and would put it on the radio. They had popular tunes, which, you can't underestimate the importance of that. Retail, because popular tunes put those records out on jukeboxes. And they, in fact, John Novarese and Joe Coogee were the ones who promoted the Slim Whitman show at the Shell, which was Elvis's first public appearance. So it was a group of people who were sympathetic and understood the music and were businessmen and understood the financial possibilities. And like it says in the book, if another producer had heard Elvis doing the hiccups, he'd tell him not to. Sam said, go ahead.
Let's talk about that, because that's one of the things you point out in the book, not just applying to Sam Phillips and Elvis, but the independent spirit that existed among the musicians, among the engineers, the producers, and so forth.
Well, you're talking about it like it existed in the past, but in fact, it still exists. And it is a thread that runs throughout Memphis music, throughout all this music. I mean, you can go back to Robert Johnson, go back to Furry Lewis. I mean, those people were playing music and they were looking to make a living, but they were making their own music. And the people today do too. The advantage or disadvantage today, when you talk about contemporary musicians, is that the industry has changed so much that there's no hit possible. They may as well play for themselves because it's not like they're going to, unless it's Justin Timberlake who's from here, they're not going to make a huge amount of money. So they're playing for themselves. And I think playing for yourself is an important component of Memphis music.
Let's move ahead to the 60s, because in the 60s, of course, Memphis was really one of the key recording centers in the country. We had record labels here. We had obviously studios here, and Memphis really thrived musically in the 60s. Then come the 70s, and all of a sudden everything comes crashing down. What happened?
Well, what happened was I would go to these meetings years and years ago, and city leaders and different people would say, we have to really get the record labels to come back. That's what we need. And I would say, look, they didn't just leave us. They left everywhere, Philadelphia, they left, Detroit, they left Atlanta. The labels decided, they made a business decision that they were going to be in New York for business, in LA for production, and in Nashville for country music. Everything else could go to them. Plus there was the oil embargo, OPEC. I mean, there were a lot of world circumstances that happened in the 70s. The world changed, and the changes impacted directly the ability to make money making records. And so those companies really had to consolidate. They had to close. They couldn't have this many warehouses. They couldn't have this many salespeople out on the road. And they didn't really need it because things were changing. And as a result, the industry morphed to where what we had wasn't desirable anymore. An independent record company, and like Stax, like High, those became feeder labels or labels into to make hits for the bigger companies, where the bigger companies would buy the hits from them. So the world really changed, and it wasn't a question of something happened to Memphis as much as something happened in the world that changed the industry.
One of the themes that runs throughout your book, and we talked a little bit about this, is black and white making music together, the sort of biracial music. I guess you could say Booker T and the MGs are probably one of the poster bands for that biracial music, because you got two black and two white musicians making great hits. And of course, they are the rhythm section over at Stax. But what made that possible in Memphis? Because Memphis has, it's steeped in a history of segregation, yet here we have this integration in music. What happened?
I think, again, because people who had nothing to lose, and the city was really ignoring the music. Probably still does. The musicians were, as Larry Raspberry would say, set them up over by the cheese wheel. It just wasn't important. And I think it flew under the radar enough that it wasn't important enough for city leaders to notice or care. But the musicians always were reaching for each other. I mean, I would say the races were reaching for each other, but that may be too broad. But certainly within the musical community, they were reaching for other and found common ground. I mean, they made great music together. You know, you could hear white teenagers in the 50s could go to the Plantation Inn and hear these great black bands. That was, you know, that happened here. It didn't happen everywhere. And so there was an awareness of black music, and there was an awareness of white artists, and these white kids wanted to play black music.
Which is exactly what Sam Phillips recognized that day when Elvis walked into the studio.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your writing process, because the book doesn't read like, you know, a history book in school. It's very personal. Why did you choose to write it from that standpoint?
Well, you know, I started thinking about the book in the mid 70s, like even before I knew you, which, you know, it's 40 years. I started doing research on the book, and I always thought that I would write a history. And as I kept going through, I realized it would be terribly boring. Histories can be very dry. And frankly, when you research something for 40 years, you got a lot, you know? I mean, it could be 10,000 pages, or I could make it a couple hundred pages. And 10,000 pages, nobody would read. I mean, it just would be too dry. So I started to think about it in terms of, there are histories that are written about different segments of this. There are very good Stax, you know, histories. Robert Gordon has a good one. And I thought, I don't need to rewrite that stuff. That's all done. Somebody is that interested, they should do it. So I started thinking, let's just talk about those things within the context of the overall arc of the history. And as that evolved, I realized I should make it a story, because to me, it is a story and not a history. I didn't have to be chronological. I could, you know, go out and do it that way. And quite frankly, it was very liberating. I was able to tell the story, and that's really what Southerners do. We're storytellers.
And many times, you know, you were quoting people that you interviewed, the musicians, the producers that you interviewed.
Well, I did interviews for the National Endowment for the Humanities in the 70s under a youth grant. And I was a writer, so I had a lot of other interviews I did. And then the Smithsonian, when they came to town in 1990, we started doing interviews and researching for the Rock and Soul Museum. So they were a client of mine for over 10 years. And we did a series of interviews with the Smithsonian. And I continue to do interviews. I'm still interviewing people. So it's something I feel passionately about. I think you've got to get their stories. And I've been fortunate to get people before they passed that are really important people whose lives and stories would have been completely gone.
All right, so having written this book about the history of Memphis music, I'm sure you reflected on the future. What does the future look like for Memphis music?
Well, I think it's really bright. I mean, listen, there are people now who are very successful rappers that are coming out of Memphis. So it's the industry has changed and evolved, and as that happened, so have the musicians. And so I think that the future is real bright. And there's always going to be a lot of people who are great players, because it's just in their DNA. There's a family history of people whose family played. And I mean, it's a huge amount of people. I mean, James Alexander's father was a musician. You know, and when you do these interviews, you realize how much music was in the house that was passed along to the kids, who became world renowned. And so now you've got Luther Dickinson, you've got Steve Selvage, you know, you've got younger people. Even Boo Mitchell, I consider to be a kid, although he's obviously not. And so the tradition continues. I mean, it is in our culture. It literally is in the culture.
Well, David, thank you very much for being on The Best Times, talking about your book. It's a highly interesting, very easy read about the history of Memphis music, Memphis Mayhem. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
We've been talking a lot about Memphis music, so I can't think of a better way to end the show than listening to some blues. One of Creative Aging's musicians has written an original song inspired by the bravery of first responders. Here's Butch Mudbone singing Fallen Heroes. Want more information about life after 50? Go online to watch more shows and find more resources. And send us your feedback and story ideas to besttimes@wkno.org. That's all for this edition of The Best Times. Please join us next week for more stories about life after 50. Until then, I'm Chris Hardaway. Thanks for watching. Good night. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you.